Sophie's world was turned upside down the moment she discovered the affair. Christian, her husband of 5 years, had not only betrayed her trust, but he had also left her pregnant and alone, shattered by a secret life she never saw coming. But just when Sophie thought she had closed the door on her past, a cryptic message from Isla Winters, the woman who had torn apart her family, pulled her back into a dangerous game of manipulation and deceit. As secrets began to unravel, Sophie found herself fighting not just for her future, but for the truth that could destroy everything she thought she knew about the man she once loved. Sophie Delgado's life had always been a delicate balance between luxury and responsibility. At 32, she had achieved more than most people dreamed of. She was the founder of a successful tech startup that specialized in developing innovative software for healthcare. Her company had expanded rapidly, and its success had brought her both financial security and a sense of accomplishment. Alongside this, she had married Christian Monroe, a billionaire who had made his fortune in Silicon Valley. Christian was the perfect complement to Sophie's ambitious yet humble nature. His world was one of vast wealth and endless opportunity, while Sophie was grounded and driven by purpose. They met during one of Sophie's early business conferences, and from the moment they spoke, Sophie was captivated by Christian's charm and his brilliant mind. Christian, in turn, was drawn to Sophie's intelligence and determination. She wasn't just another pretty face. Sophie was someone who could match him intellectually and professionally, a rarity in the world he moved in. Their connection seemed almost serendipitous, and soon they were inseparable. The relationship progressed rapidly. Christian adored Sophie, and he made sure she knew it. He showered her with gifts, took her on lavish vacations, and treated her like a queen. When Christian proposed to Sophie after 2 years of dating, it felt like a dream come true. They were married in a glamorous ceremony in the heart of Paris, surrounded by family, friends, and high-profile guests. Everything about their union seemed perfect. In the months that followed, Sophie's career continued to flourish. She was constantly in the media spotlight, recognized as one of the most promising young entrepreneurs in the country. Christian, who had become her greatest supporter, stood beside her every step of the way. Together, they appeared unstoppable. Sophie had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss in her marriage. She had complete trust in Christian. After all, what could possibly go wrong? Their life together seemed built on a foundation of mutual respect and love. When Sophie found out she was pregnant, everything shifted. Christian was over the moon with excitement, and Sophie, though nervous about the changes that motherhood would bring, felt a sense of joy that she had never experienced before. They made plans for the future, including a sprawling nursery in their Beverly Hills mansion and dreams of raising a family together. For Sophie, it was the culmination of everything she had ever wanted: a successful career, a loving husband, and a child on the way. The world seemed to be aligning perfectly for them. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, Christian's behavior began to shift. At first, Sophie chalked it up to the stresses of his work. Christian, after all, was always busy with his tech ventures. He was a mogul. His companies were constantly expanding, and his influence seemed to grow by the day. Sophie understood this, and she respected his need for space and focus. She had her own career to juggle, and they both made compromises to make their relationship work. But soon, Sophie began to notice subtle signs that something was off. Christian's business trips started to become more frequent. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, he was a high-powered CEO who traveled often. But then, his time away stretched longer and longer. Instead of the usual quick phone calls or texts to check in, Christian became distant. When he did call, Sophie noticed that his voice lacked the warmth it once had. It was as if he were going through the motions. He would make excuses about meetings that ran late or impromptu events that required his attention. Sophie didn't press him. After all, they both understood the demands of their respective careers. But there were other small things Sophie noticed. The way Christian's demeanor had changed when they were together. He no longer showered her with the same affection he had when they first met. Gone were the days of spontaneous romantic gestures and heartfelt conversations. Instead, their interactions felt routine, like a well-rehearsed script. Sophie would ask about his day, and Christian would respond with a vague answer, offering little insight into his life. When they did spend time together, Sophie found herself doing most of the talking, while Christian seemed preoccupied with something else. At night, he would retreat into his office, spending hours on his computer while Sophie lay awake in bed, feeling more alone than ever before. Christian's behavior wasn't overtly suspicious, but the changes were enough to cause a knot to form in Sophie's stomach. She wondered if she was simply overreacting. Pregnancy had a way of making emotions feel heightened, and perhaps it was just the hormones playing tricks on her. But as the weeks went by, the distance between them grew, and Sophie couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in her chest. She tried to talk to Christian about it, but every time she brought up her concerns, he brushed her off with a smile, assuring her that everything was fine. "It's just the pressure of work, Sophie. You know how it is," he'd say, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before turning his attention back to his phone or his laptop. Sophie hated feeling like she was imagining things, but her gut told her something was wrong. The once passionate relationship they had shared now felt more like an obligation. Still, Sophie pushed forward. She had a business to run, and soon she would have a baby to care for. She didn't want to let her personal worries distract her from the success she had worked so hard to build. But things were about to take a dramatic turn. It was a Friday evening, and Christian was on yet another business trip. This time, a week-long stay in New York for a major industry conference. Sophie was at home, relaxing in the living room with a cup of tea, scrolling through her phone. As she checked her emails, a notification popped up, a message from an unknown number. Sophie hesitated for a moment before opening it. What she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a photo, Christian, in a restaurant, holding hands with a stunning woman. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She recognized Christian immediately, but the woman beside him was unfamiliar. She looked at the photo, her hands trembling, but there was more. As she swiped to the next image, there were more pictures. Christian and the woman together at a hotel, then at a beach, then in what appeared to be a private jet. The images were intimate, and the woman's closeness to Christian was undeniable. Each photo was a stab to Sophie's heart, and she felt her world begin to collapse. The shock wasn't just in the images, it was in the realization that this wasn't a mistake or a simple flirtation. This was an affair, and it had been going on for months. The woman in the photos was Isla Winters, a model Sophie had seen in magazines and on billboards, but never imagined she would be involved with her husband. How long had Christian been keeping this from her? Sophie's head spun, her thoughts racing as she struggled to comprehend what she had just uncovered. This was the moment that everything changed. The perfect life, the trust she had in Christian, the future they had planned, all shattered in an instant. Sophie's hands shook as she sent a text to Christian, demanding answers. But there was no immediate response. He was, after all, miles away, seemingly too far to reach. In that moment, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, and it was only the beginning of the emotional storm she was about to face. Isla Winters had never been the type of woman to let things slip through her fingers. She was sharp, determined, and fully aware of her beauty. It had opened many doors for her, but she knew that beauty alone wouldn't sustain her in a world where power and wealth were the true currency. She had learned that lesson early, and her instincts guided her every move. Isla's life had always been about positioning herself in the right place at the right time, and when Christian Monroe had walked into her life, she saw an opportunity she couldn't pass up. Their first meeting had been at a high-profile gala, an event hosted by one of the biggest names in tech. Isla had been there as part of a PR campaign for a luxury brand she had modeled for, and Christian had been one of the many wealthy businessmen mingling in the crowd. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment Isla had wondered if it was the start of something more than just a casual encounter. She had heard whispers about Christian Monroe, his empire, his intelligence, and most importantly, his ability to get things done. He was a man who could change the trajectory of her life if she played her cards right. At first, their interaction had been innocent enough. A casual conversation about technology, innovation, and the future. But Christian was taken with Isla's charm and beauty, and he found himself drawn to her in a way that surprised him. He had never been one to entertain casual flings, but something about Isla's confidence and allure made him lose his usual restraint. They exchanged numbers, and the next few days were filled with flirty texts and late-night phone calls. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and Christian, despite being married to Sophie, found himself more and more captivated by Isla. She was different from Sophie. Where Sophie was grounded and focused on her business, Isla was spontaneous, unpredictable, and daring. It wasn't long before Christian found himself in a hotel room with Isla, the boundaries between them erasing in the heat of the moment. The affair, at first, was exciting, a forbidden escape from his perfect, yet increasingly stale marriage. But as the months passed, the thrill began to fade. What started as a secret fling became something more complicated. Isla wanted more. She wasn't content with being a side piece, a fleeting distraction. She wanted Christian to leave Sophie. She wanted him to choose her. The problem was that Christian wasn't ready to make that leap. Sophie, despite everything, was a constant in his life. They shared so much: business, wealth, a future. He wasn't ready to let go of it all, even though he had grown emotionally distant from her. The idea of Sophie finding out about the affair terrified him, but what terrified him even more was the thought of losing everything he had built. Isla, however, wasn't interested in waiting around forever. She had her own ambitions, and Christian was just a stepping stone to a life she had always dreamed of. She had no intention of playing second fiddle for the rest of her life. The affair, which had started out as a simple escape, was now a ticking time bomb. Isla grew frustrated as Christian continued to delay his promises of leaving Sophie. She began to feel like the victim in the situation, despite being the one actively betraying someone else's trust. But in her eyes, she was the one who deserved the life Christian had. She had earned it through her beauty, her charm, and her willingness to take risks, and she was done waiting for Christian to make a move. One night, while Christian was away, on a business trip, Isla decided to take matters into her own hands. She was tired of being the other woman. She wanted Christian all to herself, and she was willing to destroy everything in order to make that happen. So, she made a choice that would have consequences none of them could have predicted. Isla spent hours plotting her next steps. She had grown tired of the endless promises Christian had made to her about leaving Sophie. He was never going to do it. At least, not while Sophie was pregnant and they were building a family. It was the perfect moment for her to strike. Isla wasn't just looking for revenge. She knew that her future with Christian hinged on her ability to get him to choose her, and Sophie's pregnancy was a complication she couldn't afford. Isla was smart. She knew the one thing Christian couldn't handle was losing control over the situation. He thrived on being the one in power, the one who made the decisions, and if Sophie found out about the affair, that would be the one thing Christian couldn't control. Sophie would take the power from him, and Isla would be left on the outside, looking in. In the quiet of her apartment, Isla sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had already gained access to Christian's phone several weeks ago. He had been careless, leaving his phone unlocked when he was around her. Isla had seen the way Christian trusted her, and she had used that trust to her advantage. She now had access to every photo, every text, every message he had exchanged with Sophie. It was the perfect leverage. After a moment's hesitation, Isla began to send the photos, one by one, directly to Sophie's phone. She included pictures from their trips together, moments that had seemed innocent at the time, but were now undeniable proof of their affair. Each photo was carefully chosen, each one designed to evoke the deepest sense of betrayal in Sophie. Isla knew that Sophie's pregnancy would make the betrayal hit even harder. This wasn't just an affair, It was a devastating blow to the future they had been building together. The final message she sent was simple. The truth always comes out. With that, Isla closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. She felt a rush of power, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She'd taken control of the situation, and now there was no turning back. As the hours passed, Isla waited, not knowing what would unfold next. She knew that Sophie would eventually see the photos, and when she did, everything would change. Christian would be forced to confront the truth, and Isla would be there, waiting for him to make the decision. He would have no choice but to choose her, or so she thought. But there was a part of Isla, deep down, that wondered if she had gone too far. She had pushed Christian to the edge, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to take on the fallout of her actions. Would Christian leave Sophie for her? Or would Sophie's resolve be stronger than she imagined? As the night wore on, Isla's confidence began to waver, but by then, the damage had been done. The photos had been sent, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, Isla's emotions were a whirlwind. She tried to reach Christian to gauge his reaction, but he was uncharacteristically distant, his responses cold and distant. She had no way of knowing what was happening on the other side of the phone, whether Christian was making plans to leave Sophie, or whether he was spiraling into guilt and regret. All she could do was wait, and hope that the chaos she had unleashed would bring the outcome she desired. Sophie sat alone in the quiet of her living room, her cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she scrolled through her phone. It had been a long day, filled with business calls and the usual routine of managing her growing company. Her mind, however, was preoccupied with thoughts of her upcoming baby. As the weeks passed, Sophie felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was going to be a mother, and Christian, her husband, was supposed to be by her side every step of the way. The phone buzzed, and Sophie glanced down at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. It was odd. She didn't recognize the contact, but curiosity gnawed at her. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding a little faster than usual. Sophie had been feeling increasingly unsettled lately. Christian's business trips had become longer, and the calls and texts had grown more infrequent. At first, she thought it was just the stress of his work, but a nagging feeling deep in her gut told her there was something more. She pushed those thoughts away, convincing herself she was just being paranoid. After all, Christian had always been supportive, always made time for her when it counted. But something about this message felt different. Sophie tapped the notification, her fingers trembling slightly. The first photo she saw took her breath away. It was a picture of Christian, looking relaxed and carefree at a restaurant, a woman sitting across from him. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She recognized Christian immediately, but the woman was unfamiliar. She looked stunning, elegant, poised, and clearly comfortable with Christian's attention. Sophie's stomach twisted in knots. The woman was smiling at him, her hand lightly resting on his. The closeness between them felt too intimate to be a mere friendship. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Was this some kind of mistake? Was it a picture taken out of context? Maybe they were just colleagues. But as she swiped to the next image, her heart sank further. The next photo showed Christian and the woman in what appeared to be a hotel room, their bodies close together. Sophie's mind raced, but the truth was slowly becoming undeniable. This wasn't some innocent meeting. This was an affair. Sophie felt a cold wave wash over her as she scrolled through more photos. There were images of them on a beach, walking hand in hand under the sun, laughing together as if they were a couple. Each image was like a blow to her chest, a stark reminder of the life she thought she shared with Christian, a life that was now shattered. It wasn't just the pictures that hurt, it was the realization that Christian had been hiding this from her for months. And worse, he had done it while she was pregnant with his child. Sophie's breath quickened as her world began to tilt on its axis. The pain hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming and consuming. She hadn't expected this. She never imagined that Christian, the man she had married and trusted, could betray her in such a brutal way. She had always believed that their love was special, that their bond was unbreakable. They had built their lives together, their futures intertwined. But now, it all felt like a cruel joke. Sophie stared at the photos, her eyes stinging with tears. How long had this been going on? How could he do this to her, to their unborn child? Sophie's mind spun in circles, her emotions running wild. She tried calling Christian, but the phone rang and rang with no answer. She sent him a text, demanding an explanation, but there was no response. Time seemed to stand still as Sophie sat there, alone, grappling with the shock of what she had just discovered. She couldn't even bring herself to tell anyone, her family, her friends, what she had seen. She felt too humiliated, too broken to share the depth of her pain. How could she even begin to explain something like this? How could she face anyone, knowing that Christian had betrayed her in the most painful way possible? For hours, Sophie did nothing but stare at the photos, her mind racing with questions. Why hadn't she noticed the signs sooner? There had been subtle shifts in Christian's behavior over the past few months, but she had convinced herself they were just the stresses of his job, the pressure of his empire. She had been so focused on her own work and her pregnancy that she hadn't seen the cracks in their marriage. She hadn't seen how far apart they had grown until it was too late. Eventually, she got up and paced around the room, trying to steady her breathing. The tears came, not in an explosion, but in slow, steady streams. It was as if the weight of the betrayal was too heavy for her to bear all at once. She cried not only for the loss of her relationship with Christian, but for the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared, the future they had planned for their child. It was all gone now, destroyed by the choices Christian had made. Sophie found herself trembling with rage and heartbreak. She had been loyal to him, had trusted him completely. And this was how he repaid her, by lying, by cheating, by abandoning her when she needed him the most. The thought of it made her sick to her stomach. She tried to imagine what Christian had been thinking when he was with this woman, when he was holding her hand, sharing intimate moments. What had he told her about Sophie? What lies had he spun to keep the affair hidden? Was she just some pawn in his game, a woman he could deceive while playing the role of the perfect husband at home? The more Sophie thought about it, the angrier she became. She had been a fool to trust him, to believe in the illusion of their perfect life. He had taken her for granted, assuming she would never question him, never doubt him. And now, here she was, a pregnant woman, left to pick up the pieces of a shattered marriage, while he was off gallivanting with another woman. The injustice of it all felt unbearable. Her phone buzzed again, and for a brief moment, she hoped it was Christian finally reaching out to explain himself. But when she looked at the screen, she saw that it was just another message from an unknown number. Sophie didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. She had already seen everything she needed to see. She didn't need any more proof. Yet, there was a part of her that couldn't stop herself from opening the message. It was from the same number as before, and this time there was no picture attached. Instead, there was a simple message. The truth always comes out. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she read the words. She knew then that this wasn't just some random act of betrayal. Someone had sent those photos intentionally with the sole purpose of exposing Christian's lies. And that person wasn't just trying to hurt Sophie. They were making sure she knew everything. Sophie's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. She didn't know who had sent the photos, but she knew one thing for certain. Christian's betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was something much deeper, something far more calculated. The truth was ugly, and it was out in the open now. As the realization hit her, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't stay in this marriage, not after what she had seen. She had no idea how things would unfold from here. But one thing was certain. Her life with Christian was over. She would confront him, demand answers, and then she would leave. The thought of it felt both terrifying and freeing. The pain was still raw, still fresh, but Sophie knew that the only way to reclaim her life was to walk away from the man who had broken her heart. And that was exactly what she intended to do. Sophie's hands trembled as she dialed Christian's number for the 5th time that evening. The buzzing of the phone seemed deafening in the silence that had settled over the house. The cold tea on the table, untouched, was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Each unanswered call was like another stone added to the weight of her shattered reality. She had confronted him, demanded an explanation, but nothing. No response, no apology, no attempt to fix what had been broken. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The photos, the messages, the lies, they were all still vivid in Sophie's mind, as fresh as the moment she first saw them. It was like a nightmare that refused to end. She had never imagined this would be her life, caught in the cruel reality of betrayal, her trust in the man she loved torn to shreds. She had spent hours agonizing over the decision, debating whether or not she should leave him. But now there was no question. Sophie wasn't sure if it was the baby growing inside her, or the sheer betrayal that weighed her down. But she knew she couldn't stay in this toxic relationship. Not anymore. Sophie had been strong for so long. She had always been the woman who managed everything, her business, her ambitions, her marriage. But now, in the face of Christian's infidelity, all that control seemed to slip through her fingers. She felt helpless, like a puppet being pulled in every direction, unable to regain her footing. She couldn't help but wonder, how had everything gone so wrong? What had Christian seen in Isla Winters that he couldn't find in her? Sophie had always believed that love was enough to keep two people together, but she was beginning to realize how easily that belief could be shattered. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she wiped them away, determined not to let herself break down completely. She needed to act. She couldn't let Christian's silence make her doubt herself. Her mind wandered to the baby growing inside her. Her child deserved better than this, deserved a life filled with love, trust, and security. The moment she had seen the photos, she had known that Christian wasn't the man she thought he was. He had chosen someone else. He had chosen to betray her. And in that moment, Sophie knew that he would never be the man she needed him to be, the father she had envisioned for their child. Sophie stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, each one pushing her further toward the inevitable confrontation. She had to find a way to make him face what he had done. But she also knew she needed to protect herself, emotionally and financially. She couldn't let Christian manipulate her again. She had worked too hard to build her own career, her own independence. She couldn't let him walk away without being held accountable for his actions. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed her phone and began typing a message. It was short and direct. "We need to talk. I'm done. You've lost me. You'll never see me the same way again." She stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of the words sink in. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the lies, the deceit, and the emotional distance that had built up between them for months. Christian had never truly been there for her, not when she needed him most, and now the distance had become a chasm too wide to bridge. With a deep breath, Sophie hit send. Almost immediately, Christian called her back. The sound of his voice made her stomach lurch, but she answered the phone anyway, her resolve hardening. "Sophie," Christian's voice came through the line, thick with a hint of worry. "I'm sorry, okay? I know I messed up. Please just listen to me." Sophie's heart hardened. She had heard this before, his apologies, his promises to change, his assurances that things would be different. But none of it mattered now. None of it could undo the damage he had caused. "I don't need you to apologize, Christian," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I don't need you to promise me anything. I don't even need you to explain yourself. I saw the photos. I saw everything. I saw." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of Christian's breath hitching. Sophie could hear the panic creeping into his voice as he tried to salvage the situation. Sophie, please, I can explain. It's not what you think. Isla, it was just a fling. I never meant for you to find out like this. Her blood ran cold at his words. The casualness in his voice made her sick. Just a fling? He had the audacity to downplay it, to try and minimize the pain he had caused. Sophie clenched her jaw. This wasn't about Isla Winters. It was about Christian's betrayal, his lack of respect for her, their marriage, and their future together. A fling, she repeated, her voice rising. You think you can just call it a fling and that makes it okay? You think that makes everything better? Christian's voice faltered. Sophie, I love you. I never meant for it to go this far. I got caught up in things, but it didn't mean anything. I was just lost. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. Sophie felt her anger flare. She had spent so many nights alone, wondering what had changed between them, trying to understand why Christian had become a stranger in their home. Now, she had the answer. It was a simple one. He had never truly been there. The man she married, the man she thought she knew, had been living a double life, and now he wanted her to fix it, to fix him. She couldn't believe the audacity of it. No, she said, her voice shaking with the force of her conviction. I won't fix this. I'm done. I'm done with you. I can't keep pretending. Everything is fine when you've broken me like this. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Sophie thought Christian might say something more, but the only sound that came through the line was the heavy breathing of a man who knew he had lost everything. Sophie didn't wait for him to speak again. She ended the call, and just like that, she severed the last remaining thread of their connection. Sophie collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling. She had done it. She had finally taken control. For the first time in a long time, she felt a strange sense of relief, but it wasn't the kind of relief she had hoped for. The pain of betrayal still lingered, gnawing at her insides. She had loved Christian with everything she had, and now she was left with nothing but the shattered remnants of a relationship that had once seemed perfect. But there was something else growing inside her now, a quiet strength. Sophie knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She had a baby on the way, and she would have to face the reality of raising her child without the man she had once called her partner. But she also knew that she would never again allow someone to strip away her sense of self-worth. Christian's betrayal had opened her eyes to the importance of her own happiness, her own sense of purpose, and she was ready to start building a new life, one that didn't revolve around lies and broken promises. She would no longer be the victim. She would be the woman who reclaimed her power, one step at a time. The days after the confrontation with Christian were a blur. Sophie barely remembered much of the first few days after the call, her mind too overwhelmed to process the enormity of what had happened. The house felt different now, emptier, more oppressive. Every room seemed to echo with the ghost of a life she had once imagined would stretch on forever, with Christian by her side. But now, all of it was a lie, and Sophie was left standing in the ruins of their marriage, trying to rebuild something, anything, from the pieces. She focused on what she could control: her work, her health, the future of her child. Every morning, she woke up early, pushed aside the cloud of sadness that threatened to swallow her, and threw herself into the day. She made calls, went to meetings, and worked with the same meticulous drive she had always used to succeed. At night, the house was quiet. She would sit in the nursery, staring at the crib they had picked out together, feeling the weight of the future that loomed over her. She couldn't ignore it. She had a baby to think about now. Sophie's life had been irrevocably altered, and there was no going back. Weeks passed, and the shock began to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Sophie realized she had no choice but to face the consequences of everything that had unfolded. She had to think about how she would move forward, how she would start her life over, and most importantly, how she would protect her child from the mess that Christian had created. She couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by the grief that had tried to take root in her heart. Every day was a battle, but Sophie fought it with the same strength that had always defined her. It wasn't just the emotional toll that was wearing her down. It was the practicalities, the decisions that came with the end of a marriage. Sophie had to hire a lawyer, begin the messy process of untangling their shared assets, and make sure that Christian wouldn't try to pull any manipulative moves to maintain control. She had trusted him, and he had taken that trust and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. Now she was playing a new game, one where she had to protect herself at all costs. She could no longer afford to rely on Christian for anything, not even his apologies. Despite her resolve, Sophie knew there were still moments when the weight of it all would hit her unexpectedly. Like the first time she had to go through the closet they had shared, packing away clothes that would no longer fit into the life she was trying to create. Or when she found herself at the doctor's office for a routine ultrasound, and the doctor mentioned that it was time for the baby's father to come in for some tests, a question Sophie hadn't been prepared for. The pain of hearing that, knowing that Christian had already abandoned her, already abandoned their child, was like a physical blow to her chest. The memories of what could have been haunted her, memories of a future where they would raise their child together, a family. But Sophie had learned to hold back the tears. She had learned to compartmentalize the devastation, to push it aside so she could function. And when she left the doctor's office that day, after calling her lawyer about the next steps in the divorce, she made a vow to herself. She would not let Christian break her. He had already taken so much from her, but she would not let him take her strength. No matter how hard it got, she would make it through. She would be stronger for herself and for her child. Then came the moment that shifted everything once again. Christian hadn't contacted her since that last phone call. For weeks, he had remained silent, as if he couldn't even bring himself to face the reality of what he had done. Sophie had convinced herself that he wasn't worth her time, that she didn't need any explanation or apology from him. But on one quiet afternoon, as Sophie sat in her office working on a report, her phone buzzed with a text notification. It was from an unknown number. Sophie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The message was simple. I know what you're going through. I need to meet with you. It's about Christian. Sophie froze. Her heart raced as she stared at the message. It wasn't just the message itself that unnerved her. It was the tone. The words were deliberately vague, but something in the phrasing felt like a warning, like a person who knew more than they were letting on. Sophie's instinct told her to ignore it, to move on with her life and not let anyone pull her back into Christian's world. But curiosity gnawed at her. She hadn't heard from him in so long, and yet here was someone reaching out with information. Sophie's mind raced. Was it Christian trying to contact her indirectly? Was this someone from his life? Someone who knew about the affair? Someone who could shed light on why he had done what he did? Sophie hesitated for a long moment, then reluctantly typed a response. Who are you? A few minutes later, another message appeared on her screen. Isla Winters. The name hit Sophie like a slap across the face. Isla Winters. The other woman, the one who had torn apart everything Sophie had believed in. Sophie's blood ran cold. She had spent weeks stewing in the anger and betrayal of Christian's actions. But Isla was the one who had sent the photos, the one who had intentionally tried to destroy Sophie's life. Sophie hadn't expected this. She had assumed that Isla was just a fleeting distraction, someone who had moved on after their affair was exposed. But now, here she was, reaching out. Sophie's hand clenched into a fist. Why now? Sophie wondered. Why after all this time? What more could there possibly be to say? Sophie didn't know what to think, but she made a decision. She would meet Isla. She didn't know what this woman wanted, but she wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. If Isla had anything to say, Sophie would be the one to hear it. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't be afraid. She was done being the victim in this story. The next day, Sophie met Isla at a small cafe on the edge of town. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew she had to be prepared for anything. As she entered the cafe, she saw Isla sitting at a table near the window, her posture poised and composed, as if she had nothing to hide. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, but no apology, no sign of guilt. Isla's smile was cool and detached, like they were meeting for lunch, not for a confrontation. Sophie took a seat, her nerves steeled. She wasn't going to let this woman rattle her. "I'm sure you're wondering why I reached out," Isla began, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I didn't want you to be blindsided by what's coming next." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What are you talking about?" Isla leaned in slightly, her eyes glinting with something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Christian," Isla said quietly, "he's not done with you. Not yet." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sophie felt her pulse race. What did Isla mean? What was she trying to say? "Christian's plans," Isla continued, "are bigger than you think. You're going to want to know everything. You deserve to." Sophie's mind was spinning, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Christian hadn't left her life entirely, and whatever Isla had to say, it would change everything.